Welcome to week 9 of Old Testament Survey. This week our focus will be on the books of Chronicles, and these two books focus on David and his dynasty. As we consider the background of Chronicles, the focus is on the Davidic dynasty. As we've seen in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, we were talking there about specifically the rule of David and Solomon and then the divided kingdom. And so the information would go back and forth between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. In the books of Chronicles, the information regarding the northern kingdom of Israel is just incidental. It only comes into play when there's something by way of interaction between the two kingdoms. But the focus of Chronicles is on the Davidic dynasty in the southern kingdom of Judah. What were the circumstances surrounding the writing of the book of Chronicles? Well, after the captivity was over, so this book is these two books are being written well after the other books have been compiled. And after the captivity was over, the remnant in Judah were back in the land, but they needed to be reminded of their heritage. They needed to be reminded of the covenant that God had established between himself and his people. They needed to be reminded of the importance of the temple, and expressly and importantly, they needed to be reminded of the dangers of apostasy, because they've already suffered the consequences of their previous apostasy by spending 70 years in Babylonian captivity. So they needed to be reminded of how dangerous spiritual apostasy actually was. And they also needed to be reminded of the hope that they had through the Davidic line of a coming one, the anointed one of God, the Messiah. So all of these things are encouraged and emphasized in the books of Chronicles. The Jews of the post-captivity period needed to be encouraged to rebuild their nation and to re-inhabit their nation and to repopulate their nation. They needed all the encouragement they could get. And so the writer of Chronicles is going to encourage them in all the different ways that we've just discussed. The books of Chronicles are a clear warning to the Jews that they should never, ever again forsake the temple and the worship of the living God. Jeremiah had told them that they were just going through the motions of worship. Isaiah had said, "You worship me with your lips, but your hearts are far removed from me." And so the book of Chronicles is a reminder to the people that they should guard themselves strenuously against forsaking the temple and the true, sincere spiritual worship of the living God. Not just worship by means of ritual and ceremony and outward things such as that, but a true inward condition of the heart, a condition of worship of the living God. Chronicles was written expressly from a priestly point of view. There is a continuity in substance, viewpoint, and style with the book of Ezra, and we'll study the book of Ezra next week. But when we compare the writings in Chronicles and the writing of the book of Ezra, it would certainly suggest that all of these books were written by the same individual. The chronology of Chronicles is seen on this chart. We begin with the death of Saul in the year 1010, and we come all the way up through 538, which is the year of the Edict of Cyrus, that the people could return to their land. So the Chronicles cover a period of 472 years. And you can see the major events that occurred during that period of time up in the upper part of this chart. Let's give our attention now to the contents of the books of Chronicles. They begin with a rather long genealogical preface. And after that, Chronicles relates the history of Judah during the monarchy. Now again, the monarchy is that period of time in which the kingdom was ruled, and it was a united kingdom. 20 chapters are devoted to David's reign, and then 9 chapters are devoted to the reign of his son Solomon. During the divided monarchy, the author only gives notice to the northern kingdoms where that kingdom interacted with the southern kingdom of Judah. So again, it's vastly different from what we have seen in the preceding double books, Samuel and Kings. Here, the focus is entirely on the Davidic kingdom in the southern kingdom of Judah, with only minor references being given to the northern kingdom of Israel only when they interacted with Judah during this historical time frame. If one just sits down and has a casual reading through Chronicles, and admittedly a casual reading is difficult, especially through those first chapters where we're just seeing long lists of genealogical records. But a casual reading of Chronicles would lead us to believe that it's actually nothing more than a repetition of Samuel and Kings. The stories of David and Solomon and their successors, it's all what we see in these pages of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. As a matter of fact, about half of the material in Chronicles is repeated virtually word for word from those earlier double books. So again, we might think this nothing more than a repetition of the double books of Samuel and Kings. But that's not the case. It's not just Samuel warmed over. A closer examination of the writing of Chronicles indicates there's a vast number of differences which mark Chronicles as a very distinctive work, distinct from the other 2 double books. We can go through quickly a list of some of the differences between Samuel and Kings and Chronicles. As we see here, first of all, Samuel and Kings is more biographical, whereas Chronicles is more statistical. We have more biographical information in the double books of Samuel and Kings, but we have so much more by way of statistics in the books of Chronicles. Secondly, Samuel and Kings is much more personal than Chronicles, which is more official. A third distinction is that Samuel and Kings comes from a prophetic standpoint, whereas Chronicles comes more from a priestly standpoint. A further difference is that Samuel and Kings focuses on both kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, whereas Chronicles again focuses on Judah alone, even though there are references to the northern kingdom of Israel when it is a matter of interaction between the 2 nations. In Samuel and Kings, the emphasis is on the throne, whereas in Chronicles, the emphasis is on the temple. Now, certainly there's emphasis on the temple in Samuel and Kings, but to a much lesser degree. In Chronicles, again, as we've already seen, one of the emphases is that the people are being called back to the importance of temple worship, and not just ritual and ceremony that takes place in the temple, but a true, sincere, spiritual form of worship that comes from the heart of the individual. So the emphasis is once again placed on the temple. In Samuel and Kings, we hear of the indictment of the nation. They are under the indictment of God. God is holding them accountable and responsible for their actions of apostasy. Whereas in Chronicles, we see the incitement of the nation, where they're being reminded of what has transpired because of their former apostasy, and now they're being incited to truly walk in fellowship with God and live in obedience to the teachings of the Word of God. In Samuel and Kings, the people's guilt is exposed before a holy God, whereas in Chronicles, the writer is encouraging loyalty. They've experienced the judgment of God because of their guilt before God in that 70-year period of Babylonian captivity. But in Chronicles now, they're being encouraged and admonished to be loyal to the Word of God, to the teachings of the Word of God, and to everything that God would have them to do in obedience to His Word, and in order to experience the blessings of God and not to experience, once again, the judgment of God as they've just gone through in that 70-year period of Babylonian captivity. Another difference is that in Samuel and Kings, we see a chronological progression, whereas in Chronicles, it reviews previous history. Now, what we mean by that is in Samuel and Kings, we see the chronological progression of both the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel side by side, going back and forth as each of these kingdoms, these nations, experiences a transition from one king to the next, and how they relate to one another in reference of time, in reference of chronology. Whereas in Chronicles, the author is reviewing previous history, the history that has already been recorded in Samuel and Kings, and they're reviewing that by way of reminding the people of where they have come from, what has happened, what has transpired in their captivity, why they were taken into captivity, and then an encouragement and an admonishment through the review of history to remind them of their need to remain loyal and obedient to God. Samuel and Kings record for us more from the perspective of political history, whereas Chronicles comes more from the viewpoint of religious history. Now, both are important, and both are essential for our overall understanding of the historical period, the historical time frame of the Old Testament. But we need to understand that in Samuel and Kings, the focus once again is on the throne itself, whereas in Chronicles, the emphasis is on the temple. So the throne represents political history, the temple represents religious history, and those are the two viewpoints, perspectives from which the authors of these three double sets of books come from. As we turn our attention to the teachings of Chronicles, we might ask the question, what can we in the Christian era glean from these historical recordings of these two books of Chronicles? We could ask the same question about the other two books, Samuel and Kings. What are the teachings that we should glean from these writings, and then what is the application that we can make from the teachings of these books? Well, the obvious purpose of Chronicles is to ensure and preserve the record of priestly worship from the time of Saul, the first king of Israel, to the time of Cyrus, king of Persia, who gave the edict that the people of Israel could return to the land after that 70-year period of captivity. So the book truly underscores the element of worship and the essential and central role of worship in the life of God's people. Now, an application can certainly be made from that to our present contemporary setting. The Bible overall emphasizes and underscores the essential and central role of worship. For us as individuals, we have a personal relationship with the living God through His Son, Jesus Christ. Worship is not something we do. Rather, worship is something actually who we are. It makes all the difference in the world when we can conceive of that difference and that distinction, and when we really put that distinction into practice in our own lives. Worship is not something we do when we go to that meeting place on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening, and other various times during the week, month, and year. That's not true worship. That's just ritual. That's tradition. Worship comes from the individual's heart. And the writer of Chronicles is once again underscoring the essential element of worship in the life of the individual. And certainly it has to do with the nation as a whole. but it also, and even more importantly, has to do with the individual. My heart of worship, your heart of worship, and how essential that is in the life of every individual believer. It seems that the author of the temple was focused on several different things regarding the temple. Number one, the temple is a symbol of the unity of the nation. They only had one temple. They were required to go to that temple on several occasions during the course of the year. That was a symbol of the unity of the people of the nation of Judah. They were one people. And when we think of the nation of Israel as being a nation that was actually formed by God through the lineage of one man, Abraham, when we think about the fact that God views that nation as a unit, it makes it all the more understandable as why the emphasis is placed on the temple as being a symbol of that unity of the nation. When God looks at the people of Israel, he looks at them as a whole. We see a perfect example of that in the book of Joshua. We'll look at the book of Joshua in our next study next week, but there's a graphic incident that really relates to us the importance of the unity of the nation. When God judged the people because of Achan's sin after the Battle of Jericho, and we'll talk about this more in detail next week, but when God spoke to Joshua, he said, Israel has sinned. Now, it was the sin, the action of one man, Achan, that brought about God's judgment. But God didn't look at it as an individual act of sin. He looked at it as a rebellion of the nation. So when God gives us information through the book of Chronicles about the temple being a symbol of unity of the nation, there's a consistency, a continuity that goes all the way through the nation. Yes, Achan is going to be judged. His family is going to be judged. But the entire nation of Israel suffered because of the sin of that one man. So the writer of Chronicles is emphasizing the unity of the nation as it is symbolized in the temple. Number two, the author seems to use the temple as a reminder of the nation's high calling as a priestly people. Now again, the application for us is that in the New Testament, we're told that we are a priesthood of believers. The word priest, when you study the etymology of that word, it goes all the way back to the original meaning of a bridge builder. It's such a vivid word picture. A bridge builder. A bridge builder, he closes the gap between 2 points of which you could not travel if it were not for that bridge. Several years ago, my wife and I traveled to the Grand Canyon, and as we left the Grand Canyon and we were making our way on back across Arizona, we were riding alongside this chasm, this canyon, and it just kept going for mile after mile after mile after mile. And I began to wonder how in the world, I knew we had to get on the other side of that chasm. And I began to wonder how we're going to do that. There's either got to be a bridge or this chasm, this canyon has to eventually come to an end. Well, after miles and miles traveling alongside that canyon, we came to a bridge that bridged the gap, and we were able to travel from one side to the other. We would not have possibly been able to travel across that chasm had it not been for that bridge. Well, the temple is a reminder of the fact that we are priests. Now, Jesus Christ is the ultimate high priest. Of course, he is the one who has bridged the gap between the sinfulness of man and the holiness of God. And yet now, according to the New Testament, we are a priesthood of believers. We are to be involved in helping people see and understand their need to get from the side of sinfulness to the side of holiness, and to understand that Jesus Christ is that bridge. Well, the temple was a reminder to the people of their high calling to be a priestly people, to be the nation that God intended them to be from the very beginning. You'll remember that in Genesis chapter 12, God said to Abram, I am going to bless all the nations of the earth through you. In other words, the nation of Israel was to be a priestly people, showing the Gentiles of the world how they could bridge that gap between their own sinfulness and the holiness of God. So the temple, as seen in the book of Chronicles, is a reminder to the people of their high calling to be a priestly people. Number 3, the temple is a sign that Yahweh was in the midst of his people. The temple represented the presence of God. When Solomon dedicated the temple, the Spirit of God filled the temple. It is the physical representation of the presence of God. So the emphasis was, we meet with God in this edifice that we've built, this temple into which we go in order to be with Yahweh, in the very presence of Yahweh as he is in the midst of his people. Again, the author used the temple as a standard by which national faithfulness could be measured. Now, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about that incident in Joshua, where God looks at the nation of Israel as a whole, as a unit. And the temple, according to the writings of this particular author, the temple was a standard that the people could use to measure their own national faithfulness. Now again, there is the danger of viewing the temple as the presence of God itself, and it's not. It's symbolic of the presence of God. But in Jeremiah, God said that the people had come to the point that they were placing their emphasis on the temple rather than the God of the temple. National faithfulness is measured by the temple in the spiritual sense of the word. We can use a contemporary illustration to really graphically illustrate what I'm trying to say. We can go to church on Sunday thinking that that act of going to church is a measurement of our faithfulness to God. Now, is it a display of our faithfulness to God? Absolutely. But is our true spiritual standing before God, is that measured by the simple act of going to church? Well, certainly not. That just becomes tradition, it becomes ceremony, it becomes ritual. It's not a matter of the building itself, because as we know, the New Testament teaches us that we are the spiritual building. We are the living stones that make up the church of Jesus Christ. It's not a matter of going to the temple. It's a matter of our faithfulness to God in obedience to his teaching. That's how the temple was a standard through which they could measure their faithfulness to God as a nation, as well as on the individual level. Now, next week, our discussion is going to focus on the post-exilic period, and those books are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. But Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther have to be understood as we have come to understand the historical period in Chronicles, because Chronicles, as well as the other two double books, Samuel and Kings, they all relate to us information that is vitally important for us to understand as to how the people of Israel have come to be in that period of judgment, suffering the consequences of their own spiritual apostasy, and how God now has kept his word that the Babylonian captivity, according to the prophecy of Jeremiah, was going to last for a period of 70 years. And Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther now take us beyond that 70-year period of exile to the point in time where they are able, through the Edict of Cyrus, they're able to return to the land, repopulate the land, rebuild the city, rebuild the temple, rebuild the walls around the city, repopulate the entire land of Judah. So God is going to reveal to them through the Chronicles why they've experienced. Remember, it's a review of their historical past with certain specific calls to be reminded of the fact that if we make the same mistake our forefathers made, we'll experience the same fate that they experienced. We'll experience the judgment of God. But let's not allow that to happen. Let's allow the experiences of our forefathers to give us guidance and warning that we should not follow in their footsteps, but rather we should learn from their mistakes. So next week our discussion will focus on those three books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and how they were brought back into the land and how they then began to rebuild and resettle the land. So, God bless you in your studies this week. God bless you in your review of the material in the textbook and in your responses to the questions in the textbook. And I'll look forward to sharing with you next week concerning the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther.